Welcome to Springboard, presented by Sive Paget and Rizal, where we explore the critical intersections of law, policy, and the environment. I'm this episode's host, Michael Hannaman. Our topic today is climate justice and climate resiliency in New York City. Recent events have highlighted the urgency of climate resilience and adaptation efforts. The wildfires in Los Angeles at the start of this year were devastating. In just days, entire neighborhoods were destroyed, thousands of people were displaced, and at least 29 lives were lost. The tragedy was yet another frightening reminder that we're living in a new climate reality, where extreme weather events are becoming more intense, more destructive, and more frequent. Here in New York, where SBR's offices are based, we face a number of climate risks. While wildfires may not be the threat we worry the most about, we are not immune. Just this month, wildfires in Long Island necessitated evacuations and prompted Governor Hochul to declare a state of emergency. We also face risks from rising sea levels, stronger storms, and extreme heat. We have a lot of work to do to address these risks. While climate adaptation and resiliency planning are critical across New York State, this episode focuses primarily on New York City, in part because its status as a densely populated, socioeconomically and racially diverse coastal city makes climate risk especially complex to address. However, the issues and solutions that we'll discuss are relevant to efforts elsewhere in the state and across the country. Indeed, New York City is one among many cities across the country that are investing in adaptation and resiliency planning to protect people, homes, and infrastructure from growing climate risks. But how do we decide where to focus these efforts? What does climate resilience look like at the neighborhood level? And what policies are needed to ensure these plans benefit all communities, including those which are already disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards? We are honored to be joined for this episode by Professor Sheila Foster, Professor of Climate at the Columbia Climate School and affiliated faculty member at Columbia Law School. Professor Foster is a leading scholar on environmental and climate justice, urban policy, land use, and local government. She has written extensively on city governance and the role of cities in addressing climate change and other international challenges. Professor Foster also co-directs LabGov, an applied research laboratory that advances collaboration between city governments, local communities, universities, and the private sector to develop community-led solutions to urban challenges. She's a co-chair of the New York City Panel on Climate Change, an independent advisory body that mobilizes climate change research to advise city policymakers on resiliency and adaptation efforts. And she's a member of New York City's Environmental Justice Advisory Board, which is an appointed group of environmental justice leaders that advises the city in assessing environmental equity issues and incorporating environmental justice in city decision-making. Professor Foster was also the chair of the Advisory Board for the Global Parliament of Mayors from 2017 to 2020. A brief note before we begin. As you might expect from this bio, this conversation with Professor Foster was wide-ranging, and we unfortunately didn't have time to dig into the nuts and bolts of every topic we covered. Later in this conversation, Professor Foster advocates for community land trusts and land banks as an intervention to help prevent the climate gentrification that might otherwise result from resiliency projects. There's a lot to explore there, and it could be the subject of an entire episode. If you're interested in learning more in the meantime, head over to our show notes for links to additional resources and reading. So with that, let's get into it. Welcome to Springboard, Professor Foster.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that amazing introduction.
Thank you for joining us. So we know climate change is already affecting New York City in tangible ways. From your perspective, what are the most pressing climate adaptation and resiliency issues that the city needs to address right now?
Yeah, so there are a number of issues that we are seeing have impacted and are impacting New York City. And some of them are what we call slow onset events, and some of them are rapid events. So a rapid event is, a hurricane, like Hurricane Sandy, obviously Hurricane Ida, and what are called rain bombs, where we are inundated by water and people that are in basement apartments and low-lying areas are particularly vulnerable to that. And then we have slower onset events, like we were on the precipice of a drought, right? And so that's something that we'll have to pay attention to in the coming years. And then there are other persistent events like extreme heat. And that is going to be a continued challenge. And again, not everyone is equally vulnerable or resilient. And that's where issues of, I think, equity and justice come in. So those are some examples of the challenges facing New York and the infrastructure of New York, transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and other kinds of infrastructure.
Yeah, and in this context of climate resiliency, both these rapid onset events and these sort of slow events, how do you define climate justice in this context?
Climate justice is typically defined as a multi-dimensional framework for looking at climate impacts and who's vulnerable. And one dimension is distributive, which is just a map. And we do have these maps now to see who is most vulnerable to particular kinds of impacts. So that's the distributive framework. There's a procedural framework, a procedural justice dimension that asks, who gets to say or who gets to have input in to the responses to that vulnerability, and even who's got the expertise to say who's vulnerable. That is, and so to situate some communities as experts in terms of what they're experiencing. And then there's a third dimension. Sometimes people call it recognitional justice. Sometimes people call it contextual justice. But it's basically a recognition that not every community is situated similarly. They have different histories. They have different drivers of vulnerability. And to recognize that and to contextualize it to those communities and to respond appropriately is part of the climate justice framework.
How do you see these sort of three prongs of climate justice playing out in New York City?
So this is part of the work of the New York Panel on Climate Change, which in some sense mirrors the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. It's to bring together the best science, both climate science and social science, to help New York City understand how it needs to adapt and respond. And so on the distributive dimension, we have done a couple of things, right? There's lots of mapping and application of like social vulnerability indices to help understand the areas at the neighborhood level, right? The areas most vulnerable to different kinds of impacts, but not only that, to displacement when New York City does invest in adaptation. So for instance, if you're going to plant trees and put in new infrastructure somewhere, green infrastructure, that could actually raise land values and displace folks. So the last NPCC report on equity and justice, one of the things we did is we came up with a mixed index that blends social vulnerability, climate risk, and anti-displacement. So that's on the distributive front, just helping New York City understand that. On the contextual and recognitional front, right, we highlighted for the city why it is some communities are vulnerable. So we know that, for instance, communities that were formerly redlined across the country and in most cities have much higher heat indices, right? Heat impacts in those communities. So if you're going to figure out where to put trees or a tree canopy or to put solar on roofs or whatever the intervention is, to know that those areas are the ones that will be hotter in a heat wave, and also that those communities have less ability to be resilient. So the contextual is, why is it? What are the factors that are driving that? And how can we not aggravate those factors? And how can we take those account? And then on the procedural front, New York City is doing a lot to bring communities, in particular environmental justice and climate justice groups, who sometimes have their own plan. So We Act in Harlem put out a Northern Manhattan Climate Adaptation Plan to bring those communities to the table. And that's in part the Environmental Justice Advisory Board is now doing that, to bring those communities to the table to help come up with intervention.
Right. And so in your experience working on these issues as an advisor to New York City and working on the ground with community groups and community-based organizations, and also as a legal scholar, do these entities tend to share an understanding of what climate justice is and looks like, or are their understandings different? And if so, how do we navigate that as a city?
It's a good question because, climate justice grows in part out of environmental justice, which is now a 30 to 40-year-old movement. And one of the core, mantras of that movement is we speak for ourselves. The idea is that communities that are making claims for justice are the ones that define what that is. And so what does that look like in the climate justice area? There's an international dimension to climate justice, which is about, the people that contribute the most to the problem, the global north, are not the ones that are suffering the most. It's the global south and small island states. So I think that here, if you bring that domestically, the communities that are on the front lines, as we say, of climate justice are the ones that are articulating the ways in not only what the impacts are, but what they need. And that looks different in different communities. So aside from the three dimensions, I think the specific claims for what does climate justice mean, for instance, in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where Uprose, a community group, has a grid project to redevelop the port there. That looks a little different than it does in Harlem or in the South Bronx with The Point or Bronx Unite, for instance. So different community groups have different claims for climate justice in their communities, depending, again, on the context, their historical context, what's making them vulnerable, and what their needs are in terms of creating, self-sustaining communities in terms of climate, in terms of economics, in terms of social infrastructure as well. So it does look different, right? So you have these three dimensions, but the specific ways in which those play out is going to be different. And that's why I think the city is on the ground in these communities and has set up various ways for input, the climate knowledge exchanges, climate strong communities. There are various programs being piloted or led by New York City in which the city is trying to be responsive to those more contextual climate justice issues.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about these contextual issues and how climate risks differ by neighborhood and by community, even within New York City. Now, it sounds like a lot of the challenge is, in a sense, an informational challenge as well. You talked just a bit ago about, mapping and indices looking at neighborhood level vulnerability. And I know that in recent years, New York City, as you mentioned, has put out the EJ NYC mapping tool. And there's also scientific reports that have been developed by the New York City panel on climate change. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about these efforts, like what kinds of data have been gathered regarding climate risk and by who, and how really should we use this information to ensure equitable climate adaptation?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of data gathered, and coming back to the law part, like a lot of these bodies and efforts are written into local law, right? So the Environmental Justice Advisory Board is required now by local law, right? The NPCC is embedded in local law. So the city has to be responsive to these issues and to bring the best science, including social science. So that comes to the data. And where does the data come from? In some cases, it's created at the city level, but the NPCC, the Panel on Climate Change, these are what we call assessments. We're not creating science, but we're assessing the science that is out there. So for instance, when we look at social vulnerability indices, that's an index that was created by researchers many, many decades ago in the climate field to try to understand the various drivers, access to cars, access to health insurance, income, and housing quality, et cetera, that drives vulnerability to climate change. So we take the best of that science and then see what that looks like in New York, or adapts maybe that index for New York. And the same with flooding, vulnerability indices, et cetera. There's science out there, the social science of, again, why are some people more vulnerable? What is the relationship to historical legacies of land use, inequality, and why public housing is at risk for flooding, or why certain communities are where they are and more at risk? Helping the city to understand that, and again, pulling that science that's out there in the world and making it relevant to how New York City responds. So that is really the job of the experts on these panels and on these bodies. And the same with the Environmental Justice Advisory Board and the EJ screen and report, is that a lot of these are tools to help the city understand, again, the equity issues across the city, but also in context. And it's hard to create an adaptation plan or a resiliency plan without good data. And so this is the point, right? You have to understand what you're responding to and whether the responses you put in place, it may help the climate impact, but it may aggravate, economic issues or inequity issues. And so that, I think, is why the data is so crucial, to get the data right and to have that as a foundation of the city's response.
Yeah, so we have this data that's been either collected or aggregated or presented by these various bodies within the city. And as you mentioned, we also have local advocacy, like in Harlem and in Sunset Park. How did these two things come together in practical terms, in terms of local advocacy?
A lot of in two ways. One is through collaborative structures like these bodies, the Environmental Justice Advisory Body, which has folks like myself, but also representatives of these community organizations, people in communities. So I think one thing the city does is to co-create the response that is responsive to those communities. So that's the first way. The second way is when the city creates programs, let's say solar on top of, or green roofs, right, on top of public buildings or new construction. How does the city implement that program? Does it do so uniformly across neighborhoods, or should it be attentive to, again, some of these equity factors like the threat of climate gentrification, of which there's now a large literature on? And the literature suggests that some adaptive policies or adaptive behavior can aggravate injustice. For instance, we have studies that show that people that are moving away from the coast in Miami because their property values are going down are moving inland, right? And that's adaptive behavior, right? But when they move inland, they're moving to historically disinvested neighborhoods like Little Haiti and displacing those folks. And similarly, in New York City, if you're going to green a neighborhood and put, have green roofs and solar and plant more trees, et cetera, we now have data that shows that that is going to raise land values and displace. So how does the city do that differently? So one way that these neighborhood groups and this advocacy is important for the city is to working with the city and implementing those policies in a way that doesn't aggravate the unequal landscape on which climate impacts fall, right?
Yeah, and staying with this topic of climate gentrification, so this idea that these resilience projects will, drive up property values or cause displacement. Are there certain kinds of policies or strategies that have been effective, or that, community groups are advocating for, that could help prevent local resiliency projects from becoming a driver of displacement?
Yes, it's a good question. So I'm going to give an example. In New York, Sandy hit the Rockaways very hard in Queens, right? The area close to JFK Airport. That's been a vulnerable area in terms of, coastal flooding. And so after Sandy, the city created a collaborative planning process for that, for Edgemere, which is a community in the Rockaways that was particularly hard hit, that has public housing, low income, a lot of low income communities, lack of transportation options, lack of commercial options there. And so they spent many years in the planning process to be responsive, to do manage retreat, to kind of build a way to put up some barriers to make that area more resilient, and to reconstruct, some of the natural buffer, and to bring more commercial activity and more transportation options. In light of the fact that, again, land values will go up, they were trying to be responsive to to the community's fear of displacement. And so at the end of the process, one of the things that the community pushed for there was a community land trust. And that is one of the interventions that we know can hold land values down. And what that is that there's a lot of vacant land that the city has control over in that area. And so when they're bringing either new housing or new commercial uses, one of the things that you can do is to transfer that vacant land and develop that land in the context of a land trust, which the land trust is a nonprofit that holds the title to the land, but then gives long-term leases to people who are occupying the land, either single housing or multifamily housing, or a commercial business. And that keeps the cost of using the land affordable. And when that tenant transfers, right, this 99-year lease to someone else, they get a portion of the equity when they leave, but the rest is left with the land trust to keep it affordable. Essentially, the land trust operates as a value capture mechanism and kind of is a circular way of keeping that money in the community to keep that land affordable. And we see the explosion of land trusts in the climate resiliency area all over the country. I was involved in helping to create a community land trust and land bank in Baton Rouge. So one of the interventions there is a land bank to hold that property so speculators aren't shopping at the bit, and to raise funds to help people rebuild, and then to either lease the property back to them or sell it back to them, right, when there's a help of rebuilding. So those are examples of effective interventions when you're doing either responses to a disaster or longer term resiliency planning that helps with the land value issue, which goes right to the climate gentrification issue.
Yeah, good. I'm really glad you brought up community land trust, because when we think of climate resiliency, we're often thinking about big infrastructural projects like seawalls, improving energy infrastructure, but there are also these non-infrastructural components of climate resiliency. So I'm curious, are there other kinds of programs or policies or even practices in addition to community land trusts that are important to develop, whether at the local neighborhood level or at the citywide level as part of our resiliency planning?
So yes, there are many. You mean that touch equity or just in general? Because there are, I think, a lot of different kinds of interventions, including, I mean, if you think about energy infrastructure, distributed energy, which means that there could be local microgrids, for instance, in addition to community solar, right? So a lot of people don't own their homes, or they're renting, right? And so they can't take advantage of, let's say, some of the incentives to put solar on top of your home and then to reap those costs. Or if you own your home, your roof is not in a great position. So both the local government and the state can create an enabling environment for communities to take advantage of community solar. They can put solar on a commercial building's roof and then share the benefits of that solar through net metering laws. So distributed energy, I think, is a kind of response because, again, if costs go up in the short term, one of the ways is that you can offset that through reducing people's energy burdens. So that's another way. And also it helps to create a more reliable grid if the larger grid goes off, right, or goes down. And some of the microgrids, for instance, or the solar can help you to island from that in a disaster, right, and keep people's power on. And we've seen that work, although in wealthier communities in Florida, right, there are whole communities that whose energy, right, is resilient during a disaster because most of the people have solar, right, on their houses. But those are wealthy communities. So there's an attempt to do that on a more distributed scale in lower income communities or climate vulnerable communities, socially vulnerable communities. So things like that. I think there's a lot of creativity in how we think about infrastructure and resiliency in a way that both allows us to be resilient to climate impacts, because everyone is vulnerable, but also to help those most vulnerable when we are bringing in new infrastructure.
Right. So just to emphasize this point, community solar benefits vulnerable communities in a number of ways. It not only reduces reliance on centralized power plants, but also promotes grid reliability during disasters and gives renters and those who aren't otherwise in a position to install their own solar access to clean energy and potentially lower electricity bills. What is your sense of how widespread community solar is at this moment in New York City? And are there certain kinds of policies that would promote more production of community solar projects across the city?
I think there are a lot of proposals and a lot of activity in different neighborhoods, both in New York City and in places like Westchester and in New Jersey, in the region, that are trying to stand those projects up. One interesting, I think, example of what this looks like in New York. So I mentioned WEAC's climate adaptation plan, Northern Manhattan climate adaptation plan. And one of the things that they recommended was a microgrid in West Harlem that would pull excess energy from public buildings. New York City has a policy where solar is on public building, public hospitals, public colleges. And so WEAC's idea was to create a microgrid on top of, affordable housing units or public housing units that would pull some of that excess energy from the public buildings to power up a microgrid for Harlem. So that's an example of a creative response, that is leveraging a policy that the city already has for public buildings, but also sharing the benefits of, that policy, the excess energy that's produced by that solar. And so I think there's a lot of creativity. Again, if you look at the grid project in Sunset Park, that has an element of community, solar and community distributed energy, what some people call energy democracy, right? This idea that communities should have a say in how they get their energy and from what sources. You do need a legal enabling environment for that, right? So that's what I was talking about. And so certain states like New York do have net metering laws. And then we have the CLCPA law here that is very attentive to an energy transition that facilitates that kind of distributive energy, but also has a requirement that 40% of the benefits from that transition flow to, low income and disadvantaged communities.
And what is your sense of how New York City, New York State, and the federal government are coordinating on climate resiliency efforts, or perhaps failing to coordinate in some areas?
So under the previous administration, I think there was a lot of coordination. The Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law facilitated that coordination through programs and agencies. So under the Inflation Reduction Act, as an example, written into the act were a direction from Congress to fund a lot of, community change grants, to fund environmental justice programs at the community level, at the Department of Education. We saw a lot of planning grants come down to local governments and communities. There was an energy justice office set up there. I mean, all that's now changing as, happy to talk about how, but I think there was a strong partnership between the federal government through congressional appropriations in those laws, but also through the programs that were set up at agencies across the federal government, not just EPA and DOE, but also HUD and FEMA through block grants, et cetera. So there were a ton of programs set up where that money was flowing through states and also at the household level. A lot of the Inflation Reduction Act were incentives for, resilient housing, for putting solar on your roof, for upgrading the efficiency of your appliances and your windows, et cetera. Like there were direct incentives at the household level, in addition to the community level. All that's changing now, I think it's safe to say. But the federal government can be an effective partner, an enabling partner in this, as I think the last administration illustrated.
Yeah. So in a situation like we're in now, where the federal government is retreating from these incentives and from, this sort of climate resiliency work, what do you think the role is of cities like New York City continue to advance clean energy or climate resiliency and to make so in an equitable way, maybe even on a more national stage, or at least a broader stage than just the boundaries of New York City?
So I think we've seen, even in the last administration, pulling out of Paris, for instance, as this administration has already started that process again, is that states and cities are trying to step into the breach. So the question is, what is their ability to do so? And I think there's a strong ability to do so, starting with the states, right? If you the electricity market, let's say, as an example, has a wholesale component that is overseen by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that generates energy and then distributes it across interstate lines. But the retail market, right, how that energy gets to consumers, the choice consumers have in that is all state authorized and driven. And that's where you see states with renewable portfolio, right, commitments, where you see things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative among the northeastern states that invest some of the proceeds from that initiative into, low-income communities or reducing people's energy bills, but also into more renewable energy coming into households. So And cities like New York, right, are what New York has done in its new policy that because 70% of greenhouse gases come from buildings, there is now a requirement that buildings over 25,000 square feet electrify, basically, or reduce those emissions. And so New York City can do that. And, the cities only have the power that their states give them. But one of the powers, the strongest powers that most cities have is over their actual physical home, right? Over their infrastructure, how they zone. I mean, the state can preempt that. And we do see some state preemption on gas bans. So subject to those limits, cities can do a lot, and cities have been doing a lot, states and cities. And I think we'll see that continue and perhaps even ramp up. I think we'll also see, as we're seeing with congestion pricing now, some federal government intrusion into issues that some might think should be or have been firmly put at the state and local level. I mean, congestion pricing is a little different because it needed the authority of the federal Department of Transportation in a way that a lot of city action doesn't need. But I think we'll continue to see a kind of muscular federalism going forward, with the states and cities really becoming more aggressive as they were during the last administration of President Trump.
Yeah, so we talked about the relationship between the city, the state, and the federal government. And I'm curious to what extent there is, or there could or should be, also efforts that are coordinated across cities or across a region toward promoting climate resiliency and equity in terms of how we adapt.
So that's a good question. So as you know, I work with global mayors, and we see international networks of mayors like C40, which are the largest cities in the world that have really been transformative on climate action. If you look at the amount of money that that body is spending on climate mitigation and adaptation goals, and then even holding each other to those goals, that's been quite impressive. So, when President Trump in 2017 announced he was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, you may recall that the mayor of Paris and Pittsburgh wrote an op-ed and said, cities will get the job done. And similarly, in the U.S., we have climate mayors, and we have another network called America's All In that is made up of governors, mayors, the private sector, nonprofits, church leaders, et cetera. So I think we've seen this move from what I would call government to governance, right? That even when certain aspects of government, federals in some states in the U.S., including red states, are either not moving or retreating on some of these commitments, we do see different sectors come together in different and subnational and sub-state governments that are exercising the soft power sometimes that they have, right, to move this agenda along. The agenda could be a transition to more renewables. It could be toward climate justice. So we see increasingly city climate action plans mentioning, so there have been studies of this, that there's been an explosion of those plans that incorporate an equity or justice aspect, because a lot of recent disasters and climate or extreme events really reveal, I think, those inequalities within a city. So I do think we see lots of different collaborative, groups or networks pushing these policies, even in the absence of a strong federal government. And we'll continue to see that.
And so with that in mind, is there anything in particular that gives you hope when it comes to climate resiliency and climate justice efforts here in New York City? And what worries you at the moment?
Gives me hope is, one of the things we did in the last New York City Panel Climate Change Report, NPCC 4 on climate justice, is that we reviewed the city's progress from our last report, which was in 2019, to the recent report. And it's kind of incredible what the city has done. And by the city, I don't just mean the mayor, but also city council, in local law, as well as these various programs that I've mentioned. So that gives me hope, is that we do have a responsive government that is trying to do its best on these issues, trying to listen to communities, trying to work with different stakeholders around the city, and trying to do so in a thoughtful way. What worries me is, in this particular moment, I think there's a tremendous backlash against all these efforts. I mean, if you look at the president's executive orders, everything that has to do with equality or inclusion, is now wrapped up in an anti-DEI framing in which a welcome mat, an open door begins to look like, a do not come in sign, right? And so, in other words, efforts to respond, to be inclusive, to make sure no one's left behind, to make sure all communities are protected, begins to look like discrimination in their mind. And so I think that backlash worries me because that obviously has implications for funding. A lot of the funding for the programs that have been most robust at the state and local level around the country, not all of it, but a significant portion comes from the federal government, and we see a serious retrenchment in that. And so that's going to have, I think, knockoff effects. The other thing that gives me hope are the students that I teach. I think, there's the demand for the climate school, the demand for these programs is strong, which suggests that the cultural shift, the social tipping point on climate change and climate justice has already happened, right? There have been enough moments where people realize that we need to do something differently, and everyone needs to be protected. And so no matter what the federal government does, I think that cultural shift has taken place, and that gives me hope. And I think actually the private sector is there with a lot of this, and they've made investments that can't be undone. And I think the IRA and other incentive programs, the carrots that went out into the economy, there are sunk costs, I think, in the energy transition that are not, that train has kind of left the station. So I think we're in a moment here of retrenchment, but I think the train will keep moving forward on both, climate resiliency and the energy transition and climate justice and energy justice. So I'm hopeful overall.
Well, I think that's an optimistic note to end on. So thank you so much, Professor Foster, for joining us today and for sharing your insights on how we can pursue climate resiliency in an equitable and community-led way.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. This was Springboard. Stay tuned for future episodes where we'll continue exploring the intersections of law, policy, and the environment.
The content of this podcast and its supplemental material is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers in their individual capacities and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Side Paget and Rizal and or any of the clients they represent.